All right, everyone, we will begin our monthly webinar. So hello, everyone, and happy Valentine's Day. Welcome to our Hoard's Dairyman monthly webinar series. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an editor for Hoard's Dairyman magazine. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, which is titled, What the New NRC Means for Your Herd. Many working in dairy cattle nutrition have been eagerly awaiting this 8th update of the book, The Nutrient Requirements of Dairy Cattle. Our presenter is Dr. Bill Weiss, a professor emeritus at The Ohio State University, and he co-chaired the committee that led this effort and review process. I know it's been a huge undertaking for that group, and Dr. Weiss is excited to be able to share these recommendations with you all at this point in time. Dr. Weiss will cover some of the facts in the recommendations that have changed, some of his new recommendations that have resulted as part of these the new guide that is out, and how this affects what dairy cows are fed. Our sponsor for today's webinar is QLF Quality Liquid Feeds. We thank them for their support of this program. If you are listening to the presentation live, you have access to the PDF slides as a handout. You can find those in the GoToWebinar control panel down in the handout section. Feel free to print that out. Again, it has all the slides from today's presentation and some information about our sponsor. And you can use this to take notes on or as a future reference piece for yourself. So please go ahead and print that out if you are interested. Also, if you have any questions for our speaker that you can think of now or during the presentation, please type them into the questions section of that control panel, and we will answer them after the presentation is completed. Now, it is my honor to introduce you to Dr. Weiss. Dr. Bill Weiss was a professor of dairy cattle nutrition for more than 30 years at the Ohio Agriculture Research and Development Center, which is part of the Ohio State University. He just retired from that position at the beginning of last year. During his career, Weiss's major areas of research were vitamin and mineral nutrition, energy utilization by dairy cows, and development of efficient diet formulation strategies. He was currently the co-chair of the 2021 Dairy NRC Committee. And obviously, Dr. Weiss has been a well-known researcher and presenter across the country and across the world. And we have had him on a few of our webinars, and we are so grateful to have him back with us once more to talk about these new NRC recommendations. Dr. Weiss, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to hearing your interpretation of these new dairy cattle nutrient updates.
Yeah, thank you, Abby. I was hoping, I'm from Cincinnati, so I was actually hoping to start talking about the Super Bowl last night, but in light of what happened, we'll just stick to dairy cows. What I want to talk about is a 7-year project. This was a committee effort. You can see the other committee members here. But I also want to make sure what I'm going to say is my opinion. Other committee members might have slightly different interpretations or highlight other areas of the report. But seven long years, lots of people here involved, and the book just came out in December. What I want to start with is what were we supposed to do? And NRC, or now it's NASEM, writes up what they call a statement of task, and they say this is what we want this committee to do, and that's what we're supposed to do. And basically, in a nutshell, it was to revise the 2001 report. And it's important to remember this is a revision. It's not a total rewrite. And so what we really did was more or less tweak, improve, but not completely rewrite everything. We were charged with developing equations and software that could evaluate diets relative to what we think the requirements are. And then an area where I won't discuss, but I think it's an important area, is we were also charged with to identify data deficiencies and areas of needed research, so that when the next one comes out in 10 or 15 years, the next committee will have the data they need to make the improvements needed. And again, the bottom line for most things, there's a few exceptions, but for most nutrients, we are really tweaking it. We're not rewriting it. So don't expect major changes in the way we feed cows. It's an improvement, but they're not going to be wholesale changes. This is a big book. It's 482 pages of actual text. When you put in everything else, it's over 500 pages. You can see all the chapters here. If I for this 40-minute seminar, I'd have to go through 14 pages a minute, and I'm too old to talk that fast. So I'm only going to pick a few chapters, which I'm going to hit in more or less more detail than I could if I talked about the whole book. But I want to remind everyone that there's a lot more in this book and in the software that I have time to talk about. But the areas I'm going to hit on are requirements, a bit on intake, energy, protein, and minerals. Part of this I chose because they're really important. Others are areas that I have some expertise in. But again, there's lots of things in this book that I'm not going to talk about. It doesn't mean they're not important. I simply don't have time. So how should this new book and new software change how we feed cows? Well, what I think this book can do is one is it reduces the amount of tweaking nutritionists have to do. We all use software. It might be different software than NRC, but we all use software. We formulate a diet, and then we go in and say, well, I know we need to do this and that. The equations aren't quite right, so they make adjustments. So this new book should help new guys, new nutritionists who don't understand or know all these tweaks. This should help them. They should be able to build better diets to start with. There's still adjustments needed. And for more experienced nutritionists, if they develop encounter new situations with new feeds, this book should help them build better diets, but again, without excessive tweaking, but there's still going to be adjustments needed. As we improve our ability to estimate the requirements of cows, that should mean we can feed closer and closer to what they actually need, or what's often called precision nutrition. But we still need to overfeed. But again, the better we get at defining these requirements and the sources of variation affecting those requirements, we can feed close to the requirement and reduce risk of deficiencies. A major change was in the protein and amino acid section. And again, I'm going to cover some of this, but this could be an entire webinar. But we added things to predict milk protein yield based on some amino acids and energy. And what this will allow users to do is evaluate, is a different protein source economically viable, or should I feed certain rumen protected amino acids? You can look at this, see the estimated response in milk protein, and then make some calculations on economics as whether you should feed it or not. There's a lot in the book, and there's a big chapter on metabolic disorders, and there's some information of acidosis. So this up-to-date literature review, even though these aren't necessarily in the software, if you read the book, you'll find the best current knowledge regarding these disorders. It could help improve health of cows. Again, this is a huge textbook or reference book. And if people would read this, it improves their nutritional knowledge. It may allow for nutritionists, veterinarians to make better recommendations, or producers to understand expected responses better. A few examples is there's a chapter on fat. You might use that to determine should I feed fat, what type. There's a chapter on feed additives that gives up-to-date information on expected responses. You can read that and say, will these additives likely be profitable or not? And then lastly, and we didn't get as far on this as we wanted, but there's quite a bit of discussion on variation and the potential use of that in formulation. And again, unfortunately, we just couldn't get into this because of time and limited data. But there's variation in requirements. There's variation in cows within pens. There's variation in diet composition, And all this can be considered or should be considered in formulation. I will discuss this briefly, but again, the book and the software does not use this. So give me a break and get people caught up here. I'm going to have a poll question to start it, so I'll turn it over to Abby here first right away here.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Weiss. So everyone, if you are ready to participate for a moment here, we have a poll question on the screen for you. The question is, which is correct about NRC requirements? So please pick one of these choices. They are minimum, so over-formulate diets. They meet the average in the pen, so over-formulate less. Or they are correct, formulate diets to meet requirements. So please pick one of these answers. We'll give you just a few moments here. We have a lot of votes coming in and a pretty even race right now between the choices. So give you just a few more seconds here. And then after we're done, we'll have Dr. Weiss talk about the answers. So Patty, why don't we close the poll? And the answers are going to pop up here on the screen. And I will, right there they are. So 23% picked the first choice, 41, the majority picked the middle choice, Dr. Weiss, and then the bottom option got 36%. So pretty evenly split. So
Okay.
if you want to comment on these and then go on, we'd appreciate it.
I'm not commenting directly here. You'll be addressing those in this next slide, but those results do show me there's some misconceptions about what NRC is supposed to do. And part of the problem was if you read the old books, it never said what a requirement was. It would say the calcium requirement is this, but it never defined the word requirement. So the first chapter in the book, we define what we tried to do. And when we call something a requirement, I'll just use calcium as an example. If we say this is the calcium requirement, what that means is for the average cow for the average of the cow you specify. It's not the average of all cows, but if you specify a 1,400-pound Holstein cow producing 80 pounds of milk, the number you see for the calcium requirement is what we think is the average for that type of cow, which means half the cows, if you'd feed to the requirement, half the cows would be underfed over here, and half the cows would be overfed. So it's the average, and you're going to meet the needs for half the population, but it is not the minimum. A lot of people said this is what the minimum, and you have to overformulate or not. That's not what we tried to do, but it isn't to meet the maximum. It's just the average. And so the nutritionists, and we don't want to formulate diets to the average. We don't want to underfeed half the cows in a pen. So you should, for most nutrients, you should be above what NRC says. And it's not because they're the minimum, it's just because we don't want to underfeed half the cows. So nutritionists have to, when they're formulating, the requirement meets the half, but a formulated diet should meet more than 50% of the cows or the average cow. And so nutritionists should consider variation in requirements, and wherever possible, we included this in the text. We would say the maintenance requirement for energy is this plus or minus a certain amount. So we tried to do that wherever we had adequate data. But a lot of times we didn't have adequate data, and we have no data on total requirements. In other words, we might know the variation in the maintenance requirement for energy. We know the variation in milk energy, variation in growth energy. But when we want the total, we have to add all those up, and it's not you don't just simply add the variances. So this is an area that we need work on. We spent a lot of time developing a really good feed library. It has excellent standard deviations, so users can look at that and say, okay, I need to overfeed more or less. Nutritionists need to consider economics. Sometimes it's not economical to feed every cow correctly. You might have to have some underfed cows. And then there's also situations where special situations, for example, if you have high sulfur water, the copper requirement is not going to be right. You have to make adjustments. So you should feed above what NRC says, but recognize that the NRC requirements should meet the needs for half the cows in the population. And so how do you do this? Well, again, you have to consider variation. And unfortunately, we didn't have enough data to do a lot of this, but in the human nutrient system we use in the US, if you read a food label, it gives something called the RDA, or recommended daily allowance. And the recommended daily allowance is the average requirement plus 2 standard deviations of requirement. And that, in theory, meets the entire, essentially feeds everybody correctly. There'd be no deficiencies. And this is the approach you need to take. We don't need to feed 2 standard deviations above, and I'll get to that in a minute. But you start thinking, what's the variation? Some requirements, some minerals don't have a lot of variation, or some nutrients, sorry. Some nutrients have huge variations. Variation in intake within a pen. If the pen is pretty homogeneous and eaten pretty much the same, that means you can underfeed or overfeed less, I mean. And again, if you're working with a diet that's highly variable, you're feeding a lot of byproducts that have high variation, overfeed more. Based on a lot of information here that I put together, and I don't have time to get into, if we set up something like the cow RDA, it is not going to be the average plus 2 standard deviations, and there's lots of reasons for that. And it's probably something less than 1 standard deviation. And part of the problem, or part of the reason for this, is that cows that have higher requirements, they milk more, they eat more. And so that accounts for, or that increased supply accounts for some of this. Minerals in the human system, they don't know the variation in requirements, and so they're in the same boat we're in. They just say for most minerals, it's 1.2 times the average requirement, 20% overfeeding. And again, for reasons I don't have time to go into, this is a quite reasonable safety factor for most minerals. 20% above NRC, you will meet the requirements for the vast majority of cows within a pen. Okay, there's a new term that's some people are confused about, and so we use the word requirement and we use the term adequate intake. Adequate intake is only used for vitamins and trace minerals, or some trace minerals. And when we say adequate intake, it doesn't mean this mineral or vitamin is optional. It doesn't mean you shouldn't feed it. It just means that we really don't have enough information to definitely say this is how much half the population needs. Adequate intake really means if you feed this much of the trace mineral or vitamin, you probably will not see a deficiency in the population. You will get benefits. It may not be optimal, because a lot of times you don't have enough data to say this is the optimal amount, but it's also not optional. You should at least formulate to meet the adequate intake. For a lot of vitamins and minerals, it's adequate intake times 1.2. So it doesn't mean optional, it just means we don't have enough data to say this is the requirement. And again, it's just for the fat-soluble vitamins and some trace minerals. And one last term before we get into this, in the text, this isn't in the software, but in the text for certain nutrients, we use the term response. In other words, we say we may not know the requirement for this particular nutrient, but there's data showing if you feed it, cows might respond. And we tried to include that wherever possible. Few examples, chromium, if you supplement chromium, often milk increases, but we don't have enough information to say this is the chromium requirement. Same for choline and biotin. Cows often respond, we just cannot quantify the requirement. For dry cows, which I'm not going to cover today, but we know feeding extra magnesium reduces hypocalcemia. That's not in the requirement calculations. New data or newer data showing supplemental RP methionine during transition improves health, improves immune function. These are not in the requirement calculations. So you need to read the book to kind of get these more subtle changes. Okay, what I'm going to try to do is go through segments and then stop and say, these are what I think the implications. So the implications of us actually defining requirements are that we think this should reduce the degree of overfeeding, because as in that poll, a lot of people thought these were the minimum amounts to be fed, and that's not what we're trying to do. And especially in minerals and vitamins, I've seen tremendously gross overfeeding. And so hopefully these better definitions will reduce some of the overfeeding. You still need to overfeed, but not as much as some people do. And again, with this discussion on what I'm calling the non-requirement responses, that should help users determine, should they consider these supplements or these additives or not? So but again, that's in the text. Okay. On intake, these were major changes in the equations. We developed two equations based on a huge amount of data. One equation is totally animal based. It uses user inputted milk, body weight, parity, body condition score, days in milk. And it's the old one from 2001 was, these was an old data set. There wasn't many cows producing more than 80 or 90 pounds in that thing. Probably the average was below 70 pounds of milk. In the new data set, we have lots of high producing cows, and so the prediction of intake based solely on animal factors is more accurate, clearly more accurate, and this was proven with our statistical analysis than the old equation. In addition, we added what's called an animal and feed-based equation. It has measures of what basically forage quality is the major driver. So the more forage fiber you feed, the lower the intake is going to be. The lower the in vitro fiber digestion is of the forage, the lower the intake is going to be. But it's important to remember in this equation, there is also milk yield. And milk yield is the primary driver of the equation. So you can put a rotten diet in, high NDF, poor digestibility, and say, I want this cow to produce 100 pounds of milk, and you're going to get a really high intake estimate. So on this equation, users have to put in reasonable numbers based on what they're feeding. And a good use of this is you'd put in a reasonable number with the forage information, and it says your intake is going to be less than what you anticipated. Then you would maybe adjust the milk yield down a little bit. But be realistic, or you're going to get unrealistic intake estimates using this equation. So this should, if when we look at specific subclasses, their fresh cow estimates are going to be higher in this equation than in 2001. They reflect what we think cows are doing now. On higher producing cows, the estimated intake will be less than what was seen in 2001. Cows are more efficient than we thought. But in late lactation average cows, the numbers are going to be pretty close, actually. So this should allow better diets in fresh pens and more accurate diets on higher producing cows. And again, this equation with diet factors should be useful, especially when you're anticipating a change. You might say, okay, I know my forage, my corn silage is worse than it was last month. You put in this, it estimates the change in intake, and then you can make some adjustments before you actually have to feed. So this is useful, but again, I want to caution users that milk yield is in the equation and it is the major driver. So if that's wrong, your equation is going to be wrong. Okay, on energy. We evaluated all the equations. We modified the energy supply equations a bit. I'm going to call it more of a tweaking, but these were some substantial changes, and so I think for the better. And the equations we use now should be more accurate over a wider range of diets. For the average, a typical average diet, they don't change very much. But for, say, a higher starch diet, lower starch diet, high byproduct diets, I think the new supply calculations are more accurate. The equations clearly are more accurate for high producing cows. They're more accurate for dry cows. This isn't as big a change as for the high producing cows. But one thing we maintained is that you still don't need a lot of feed composition data. You need some. These are based on feed composition, but you don't need an extreme amount of feed composition data. It's almost the same data needed for the 2001 model. One of the biggest problems of the old one was the discount factor. And this discount factor, what it did was as cows ate more, digestibility was depressed. And as the diet had higher TDN, and that was really a proxy for starch, which it didn't work as well as we wanted. But as starch in the diet went up and intake went up, digestibility went down. And it was clear that this was too great of a discount. In other words, intake did not depress digestibility nearly as much as we thought it did. And part of the problem was what we did in 2001 is we started with dry cows, and dry cows that didn't eat very much. Some of these cows ate less than 20 pounds of dry matter. And then we extrapolated up to lactating cows. So we went from a dry cow eating maybe 20 pounds of feed up to lactating cows eating 50 and 60 pounds of dry matter. And that's an awful big extrapolation. And so that was part of the problem. In 2001, we start with a cow eating 3.5% of body weight. So that's going to be roughly 50 pounds. And we extrapolate from there. So we're extrapolating a lot less. And I think that's a big reason the new equations are better. We also started with a diet of 26% starch. And again, that's not a far from an average. So we're extrapolating less. And basically in the new equations, as intake goes up for every 1% or every 1% of body weight intake goes up, fiber digestibility goes down about 1 unit. If intake goes down, fiber digestibility increases by about 1 unit. And then starch has a negative effect on fiber digestion. Intake also, well, starch has a negative effect on fiber digestion. So as starch goes up from 26%, fiber digestibility is dropped about 0.6 units. So a high starch diet, you're going to get some depression in NDF digestibility. And it's a deviation from 26. And the only other nutrient that's affected by intake, and this is the data we had, we could not tease out effects of intake on anything other than fiber and starch. And as starch intake, as dry matter intake goes up for every 1 percentage unit above 3.5, starch digestibility drops. We could not find a intake effect on fatty acid digestibility or protein digestibility. So those are not affected by intake. And the bottom line is that for a typical higher producing animal with higher intakes, the discount is only about 30% as much as it was in 2001. It's much, much less. So again, higher intake, higher producing cows are going to get more energy out of the diet, more estimated energy out of the diet than in 2001. So if you look in general, NELs of diets are going to be about 8% higher for lactating cows, and the higher the intakes, the higher the starch, the greater the difference will be. For a dry cow diet, it's going to be about 5% greater than 2001. So you're going to have to if you've used the NRC model, you just have to recalibrate your brain to get used to seeing higher energy diets for the exact same diet. And it's just mostly because of discount plus a few other changes. There is also substantial changes to requirements. And one thing I want to caution you is you have to look at, when you look at changes, you have to look at both supply and requirements for all nutrients, because a lot of these change, but some of the changes cancel out. Maintenance went up a lot. Pregnancy was modified. It's not going to have great effects, but generally in the very late dry period, energy and protein requirements are higher than before. In the early dry period, they're less. grazing requirement was substantially reduced, again, based on newer and better data. So in general, on lower average producing cows, if you look at energy balance, supply versus requirement, you're not going to see much. It's going to look pretty similar. High starch diets, energy balance will be higher on the new system than in the old one because the starch doesn't affect digestibility as much. Same with intake. If high intake cows are going to get more energy out of a diet than estimated in 2001. In dry cows, because the maintenance increased so much, the new system will give you a lower energy balance than the old system if you put everything in the same. So energy numbers are going to be different. And I just want one example here. This is a lactating cow. You can see the 90 pounds of milk. I fixed intake, so I'm not predicting intake with the two different models. I fixed intake. Simple diet here. Comparing 2001 to 2021, it's a 28% starch diet, 30 NDF, about 16.5 protein. Energy intake will be higher using the 2021 system by about 4 megacalories a day. You're going to say that's a huge difference. But remember, we also changed requirements. So when you look at energy balance in this system, in 2001, it would have said this diet would have just met requirements, no change in body condition. In the 2021 system, there's going to be a slight excess in energy. So this cow fed this diet would gain some body condition, and the same model, the same diet, same cow. In 2001, the computer would have said, no, these cows are in energy balance. So big supply changes in supplies, but the change in balance, energy balance, is going to be less. It still will often change, but it will be less. So the implications of the energy thing for, again, this average cow fed what I'm going to say a typical Midwest diet, it's not going to change much. But on higher starch, higher intake cows, we think the new model should predict body condition change more accurately. In other words, the supply and the requirements are going to be more accurate. So if you put, again, with the new system, diets with less starch than in the old system will either produce more milk or better body condition because they're going to get more energy than previously estimated. So this might mean you could have safer diets, less starch, higher forage diets, which might be cheaper. And we hope this helps prevent overconditioned cows with the new system. Protein amino acids, and again, this has undergone major changes. I can just scratch the surface. And but what I'm really going to talk about today is the response model. And they're not all the requirements. We built an equation that uses some amino acids and energy, and it says if you feed this profile of amino acids at this energy intake, we expect the cow to produce X grams of milk protein. And what this means is there's multiple, I won't say infinite, but almost infinite amino acid profiles could produce the same protein yield. It isn't there. The idea of the first limiting amino acid is basically abandoned. This equation should be helpful in evaluating protein sources or supplemental amino acids because you can project or estimate change in milk protein, look at that compared to the economic cost. And it also should say, okay, in this particular diet, if you'd supplement feeds that would provide these amino acids, it should be more likely to give a response. I'm going to run through just some examples here. This is table 6.3, and this is, again, there's a lot of tables on protein, but I just want to talk about the response. For this particular diet, it's saying it should produce about 1,300 grams of milk protein. And the question you might be asking is, okay, if I change protein or add RP amino acids, is it a profitable or wise decision? And you can look at, and I'll go into this in just a second, there's a column called target metabolic efficiency, predicted metabolic efficiency. Helene Lapierre came up with these, and it's, again, I don't have time to go into these, but these are kind of considered the biologically optimal, or what we think cows should be able to do. And this is what they're actually doing based on the diet you're feeding. And if a cow is, our goal is not to maximize efficiency. That's not a wise goal, because the most efficient animal is an animal that's deficient, because that deficient animal is going to use that nutrient, every gram of that nutrient it can. But since it's deficient, you're limiting production. So our goal is to be close to the optimal or maximum efficiency, but not at the maximum. And when you compare these to these, if they're close, and I'll show an example in a minute, it says this might be an amino acid they will respond to. And this column is the estimated response. So in this example, I've identified histidine and methionine. They're very close. Histidine is essentially at the efficiency, and the diet is essentially what we predict, again, is kind of this target or optimal, suggesting histidine might be restricting milk production. Methionine is actually quite a bit lower, again, suggesting that additional methionine may increase milk protein yield, sorry. When we look at lysine in this diet, the actual efficiency is less than the target. So this is suggesting, oh, these cows don't need much lysine, much additional lysine. They may not respond very well. So this diet, you'd think about, okay, can I find supplements to increase histidine and methionine? Lysine's not that critical. Okay. And then this next column, this called regression coefficient, is the expected response. And what this means is if I'd increase metabolizable histidine 1 gram, I'd expect somewhere around 1.6 grams of milk protein, additional milk protein. If I put in a gram of metabolizable methionine, I'd expect about 1.8 grams of milk protein. It's important to remember this is basically a regression equation, which means it's plus or minus. Every time you do this, you are not going to get 1.8 grams of milk protein. Sometimes you won't get any milk protein. It's plus or minus. So there's error associated with this. But this gives you a good idea on what's expected and will this change make economic sense. So this table would be useful, again, I think, in evaluating potential changes in either RP amino acids or other alternative protein sources. So the implications is you could run a base diet, check milk protein yield. And then you might say, okay, I want to add some RP amino acids. Let's see what that does. And you enter them in, you look at change in milk protein, and you say, okay, milk protein is worth so much. The amino acids cost so much, I either will or won't do it. You can do the same thing for, you might say, should I feed canola or soy or peanut meal, whatever. Put these in, evaluate their response. And then lastly, you could say, if you look at those target efficiencies, if they're way off, it might, or if the predicted efficiency is much less, you might say, well, I'm really wasting this amino acid. Can I make a diet modification to improve or reduce the waste of these amino acids? Yeah, I need a drink of water, so I'm going to turn it back over to Abby for a minute.
Perfect timing. So we have another poll question for all of you who are listening. So please get ready to select one of the following answers. The question here is the factorial system, which is maintenance plus lactation plus growth, is used for most requirements. Which is most correct relative to minerals? The system accounts for most responses. The system misses some important responses. The system misses some important negative effects. Or read the book and adjust accordingly. So if everyone wants to take a minute and pick one of those answers, this time we've got a pretty close race between two of the selections, but we'll give everyone just a little more time to answer. We always like to have a few polls in here because it's a chance for you to kind of test your knowledge on the subject or see if you're thinking on the right track compared to our speakers. So we thank you for participating. So Patty, if you want to close that poll, and the answers will pop up here on the screen. So we had a close race between options 1 and 4. Dr. Weiss, do you want to comment on these responses?
I say this is the kind of question students love because there's really no wrong answer. And I picked this question to emphasize a few points. One is all minerals are different. For example, calcium and phosphorus, the factorial system works really well. But for other minerals, it misses a lot of important things. In most cases in the new system, there are no negative effects considered. And this is probably, the book is the most correct answer and adjust accordingly. But I want to, again, emphasize all minerals act differently. So sometimes this system is spot on. Other times the system misses some very important things. And these are discussed. We might not be able to quantify these responses, but they're discussed in the text. So for minerals, to wrap this up, basic approach was retained, but almost all equations changed for almost every single mineral. But very often you're going to say, well, they changed all this stuff, but the requirement really didn't change very much. And for the average animal, a lot of times it didn't, or an average animal fed a typical diet, it didn't. But the newer equations we think are more biologically correct. And if they're more biologically correct, it means it should fit better when everything isn't average. High producing cows, low producing cows, different types of diets. So even though you might say, boy, nothing much changed in this, if you put in certain diets, you would see, no, it really actually did change. We spent a lot of time on absorption coefficients. We improved those numbers whenever possible. On the real world thing, the minerals that you're going to notice the biggest changes to are magnesium, copper, and manganese. And again, in other situations, in specific situations, you might notice big changes to other minerals. And I want to emphasize, a lot of people do not use NRC. They use their other software, but a lot of that other software still uses NRC for minerals and vitamins. So these changes may affect you even if you don't use NRC. Okay, for magnesium, requirement increased 1.5 times for a lactating cow. This is because of the way we calculate maintenance requirement. We think the way we do it now is more correct. Basal absorption coefficient, basal ingredients increased from what was used in 2001, even though in 2001 they calculated the same number we had. They more or less built in a safety factor. We didn't do that. Instead, most of the variation in absorption of magnesium is because of diet K. We now have an equation based on diet K, so we're accounting for that variation. The absorption coefficients of magnesium for the supplements dropped a lot. You can see how big they dropped. I think I have a high degree of confidence in these numbers. We have a lot of data supporting these numbers. I think these numbers are so high is because the previous committee made a calculation error. I am not sure of that, but I think they made a calculation error. Manganese, there was some new data. It's still very, very limited. This is an adequate intake. We don't have enough data to call it a requirement. Increased maintenance, decreased substantially the absorption coefficient. This is because we did dig up some data that the 2001 committee didn't have. Bottom line is for a dry cow, we're looking at manganese adequate intakes around 40 parts per million at typical intakes. And for a cow producing 70, 80 pounds of milk, it's going to be about 30 parts per million. And again, you should tack on that 1.2% or 1.2 times safety factor. Copper, a lot of emphasis on copper because of toxicity issues. However, the way we calculated maintenance was different. We think it's biologically correct, and that ended up doubling the maintenance requirement. But the lactation requirement dropped by about 70%. And this is the concentration of copper in milk that we found. And this is several papers. This is the number used in 2001. We couldn't find any paper, recent paper, that had copper concentrations this high. So for this average cow, sorry, this is kilograms, this is a 75 pound cow roughly, there's going to be no change. For a dry cow, because maintenance increased so much, its requirement's going to be about 40% higher. For a high producing cow, because the lactation changed so much, it's going to be about 45% lower. So big changes in copper. Some limitations here is the only antagonist considered is K, the effect of K on magnesium. We know sulfur inhibits copper. When this is discussed, and some suggestions are given in the text, but this is not in the software. Phosphorus inhibits manganese, and I could go on and on and on. So the text includes discussion on antagonists, but it's not in the model with the exception of potassium and magnesium. So to wrap this up, the new book and software, and the book is integral. I know a lot of people just want the software, but the book will really help explain situations that aren't covered in the software. We hope this ends up increasing efficiency. You overfeed less. We hope it reduces health disorders and reduces the risk of using precision nutrition, because we think we're getting better and better at estimating requirements. And I've already said this, but the book is integral. It has lots of stuff that we could not quantify and put in software. And I also want to point out this was a very long process, and I had black hair when this started. If you're interested in the book, you can order it. The website here is nap.edu. The committee members do not get a commission, so we're not pushing this for that reason. It's about $150. Software is free. It's downloadable at the same site. And with that, I will turn it over to Abby for the question period.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiss, for sharing your insight and then some recommendations that are based on the thoughtful review that you and your committee did to eventually publish this new NRC. We really appreciate the work that you put into that, and I know many people in the nutrition world will be making good use of that on farms in the future. Certainly a huge undertaking, so we appreciate all the work that went into it. Also, I'd like to thank QLF for partnering with us by sponsoring this webinar. Their support of our webinar series is greatly appreciated. If you would like to view this webinar again, it will be posted on our website later this week. You can find that at hordes.com on the webinar tab, and all of our webinars from past years are available there. So you can find a wide array of topics from all of the webinars we've ever hosted, and they are all available for free on our website. If you can move the slide ahead one, Dr. Weiss, I want to invite everyone to our upcoming webinars. They always take place on the second Monday of the month at noon Central Time. In March, we will be having a presentation called The Details Add Up to High Production, and our speakers will be veterinarian Dr. Mark Hardesty from the Maria Stein Veterinary Clinic and a dairy farmer, Alex Newen-Schwander, and they will be talking about what they do at New Hope Dairy to enhance the milk production from their herd. So please make plans to attend us for that interesting and eye-opening webinar. And then in April, we'll have a very familiar voice return to our webinar series, as we'll be joined by Mike Hutchins from the University of Illinois, who will be talking about the Big 10 feed costs associated with feeding dairy cattle. That webinar will be sponsored by Kuhn. So if these topics are of interest to you, please make plans to attend. We would hope to have you on some of our future webinars. Now, Dr. Weiss, if you want to move ahead one more slide, this is the time where we'll open it up for audience questions. So we have a few questions in already, and if anyone else has something they'd like to ask Dr. Weiss, please type it into the question section right now. Also want to let you know that if you want to print out the slides for future reference, you can do that. If you go down to the handout section, you can find more information there. Print that out for yourself. So I have a question here. First starts out with a compliment, says, thank you for a great presentation, Dr. Weiss. This person wants to know why, when the predicted efficiency of methionine is greater than the target, why is that amino acid the limiting one? Can you explain that, please?
Well, the predicted is what, and I'm just going to make up some numbers. I do better with examples. But let's say you provide 100 grams of methionine and the cow uses 80 grams. So that would be an efficiency of 80%. If I'd feed 200 grams of methionine and the cow still only uses 80 grams, then it's a 40% efficiency. So you're overfeeding. But if a cow, and I don't have time to go on how these were calculated, but Helen calculated what they consider, what would be considered kind of the biological maximum. She uses a different term, but close to what we think. This is about as good as a cow ever can get on using this particular amino acid. And if you feed just to that amount, and let's say the number is 70%, and if you feed just enough methionine to give yourself a 70% efficiency, that means you're very close to where that cow is deficient, because again, maximum efficiency happens when a cow is deficient, marginally deficient in a nutrient. So you want to build in a cushion. An animal can never be 100% efficient. So if we think the optimal or maximum, approximately maximum is 75%, you want to be there or below, because if you're right at that number, it's saying, boy, this cow is trying to use every gram of methionine it possibly can, and you may be, I won't say you are, but you may be limiting production because of there's not enough of the amino acid. It can never be 100%. Your goal should be to be close to what those targets are, but you want to be your efficiency should be a little bit less, because that's saying there's a little extra amino acid there that the cow basically is wasting. It's kind of a safety factor.
Very good, thank you. Our next question, does this revision include any recommendations or also apply to grass-fed or grazed dairy cows? And what about cattle that are on grassland that might be managed using regenerative agricultural practices, so like native forages? Comments there?
Okay, there is in the chapter, and I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like production systems. There is a chapter on, or a section on grazing in general, and the bulk of the data we have, or publicly available published data, is with management intensive grazing. And so we discussed energy requirements, for example. We discussed nutrient composition of the pasture and management factors. So the energy requirements for grazing are included in the software. The other information isn't, but there is a section on grazing, but it's pretty much management intensive grazing under North American conditions. So it would be, again, predominantly cool season grasses. There's some in there on warm season, but most of the research is conducted with cool season grasses. And NRC, we're restricted. We have to use published data, but there is information in there on grazing.
Okay. The next question, are there breed differences in terms of efficiency or dry matter intake regardless of their production levels?
This was, we looked into this a lot. This was a major discussion of this committee, and I'm going to have to kind of limit this to energy because that's what I know more about. And there are studies comparing digestibility by Holsteins versus Jerseys and so on. And in general, the differences are pretty minor. They're there, but they're pretty minor. And so differences in body weight, milk composition, etc., account for most of the nutrient requirement differences between breed. So there's, and to my knowledge, I don't think there's any breed effect, but I might be wrong on one equation. But in general, if you put in good data for body weights, expected growth rates, which are going to be different for Holsteins and Jerseys, good milk composition data, the model works pretty good for both breeds.
Very good. Someone has a question here, and it sort of applies to us, and they're just recommending that perhaps there's a webinar available on software, the NRC software in the future. Dr. Weiss, do you know if there is anything like that available currently? Any kind of tutorials out there?
I think, I don't know, and I was actually going to listen to that this afternoon, but a company called Balchem has had a series of webinars, and a recent one was with Mark Hannigan, who was on our committee, and I think he went into some application of the software. But again, I have not listened to that yet. So if you Google Balchem dairy webinars or something, I'm sure it would pop up. I don't have the address with me. And I know some committee members are kind of giving workshops. I've given one or two. So I think there'll be workshops in the future, but the Mark's webinar would be where I would start right now. I think it addresses some of what the questioner asked.
Thank you for that insight. A question here, are there plans to rewrite the nutrient requirements of dairy cattle in the future? And maybe, Bill, you could talk a little bit about the process, how you got to this revision, and then when it will be revised again in the future.
Well, it might be, but I guarantee you I won't be involved with it. What they do here, and again, this is not the committee, it's the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. That's what that NASEM stands for. They have experts in agriculture, including animal agriculture, and they also ask people, experts in the area, and they say, when do you think, or do you think there's enough new information to justify a new book? And in the past, they tried to do it about every 10 years. This one started it's embarrassing to say, but it started 7 years ago, which would have been about 13-year interval. So I think they're trying to update it every 10 or 15 years. And that's, to me, is a reasonable number, because it takes time to generate new data. It takes time to, sometimes experiments show something and then additional experiments say, no, this really isn't what's going on. So I'd expect another one to start in about 10 or 15 years. There's great discussion at NASEM about should they update the whole book, or can they just say, there's been a lot of research, say, on amino acids, let's update energy and protein. Or there's a lot of data on minerals, let's update minerals. So that might be an approach too, and if they do that, my guess is updates would come a little more frequently, but they'd be limited updates. But their overall goal, I think, is about to get one out about every 15 years.
Very good. Certainly a lot of people involved to get that full revision done. So a big project to work on.
It's a huge amount of work, and we're not paid. I do want to put that plug in, and we all had day jobs as well, so we had to do those, and then this kind of on the side. So that's one reason it's kind of late in coming.
No, well, I think it's great to have it available now. And again, I'm sure people that are, especially those that are working in the dairy nutrition world, will be happy to get their hands on this resource. And as we showed you before, it's available for purchase. The book or the software can be downloaded for free. So those are now resources to all of you working and feeding dairy cattle. So it looks like that is all our questions for this webinar. So once again, thank you to Dr. Bill Weiss for your presentation and then for answering this group of questions that came in. We'd also like to thank all of you in the audience for your time and attention today. We are always glad when you can join us for one of our monthly webinars. Just a reminder that our webinars do take place the second Monday of each month If you want to advance the slide once, Dr. Weiss, we'll show you one more time the future webinars. In March on the 14th, we'll be having a presentation by a veterinarian and a dairy producer talking about what they do to maintain high milk production on their dairy herd. And then in April, we will have Dr. Mike Hutchins talk about the Big Ten feed costs. So mark your calendars, and we hope to see you on one of these future webinars. Again, I'd like to thank QLF for their sponsorship of the webinar. Let's go one more slide, Dr. Weiss. Their support of our educational program is very much appreciated. So thank you, QLF. I'd also like to thank my teammates, Michaela and Patty, who keep everything running smoothly before and after the presentations. Once again, thank you all for joining us for this month's webinar. I hope that this information can be put to good use on your farm or the clients that you work with. And until next time, thank you from all of us here at Hordes Dairymen. Goodbye and take care.